redfish on a fly, but this is proves the rest of this talk. I hope isn't quite as fishy as the slides. Remember, if you man a fish, you feed it for a day. With this bad boy, maybe a week. If you teach him how to fish, he goes out and buys some really expensive fly rods. Today we're going to talk about aortic stenosis. Structural heart is a lot more than aortic stenosis. When Tavr got started first, there's a variety of different devices and tools and techniques. And the structural heart part of cardiology is progressing very rapidly as the technologies and the engineers build things better and better. We're on the third and fourth iterations of our current aortic valves. There's at least 2 more coming to market. The Indians just, in India, just built one that looks a lot like the Edwards valve called my valve. That's through clinical trials, and I think we'll probably see that in the United States as well. There are over 60 mitral valve devices that are either in first-in-man or in pivotal trials in the United States or the world. So aortic stenosis, of course, has a history. And I think I'm going to spend some time, Sarah and I share some of the slides, but I'm going to spend some time talking about the history of how we got here and the components of the partner trials, which was Edwards, which was one of the bigger surgical valve prosthetic manufacturers, and then became the leader, national leader, and Medtronic followed in the transcatheter aortic valve space, as they say. Here's a picture of 2 diseased aortic valves. The one on my left is moderate disease. You can see some of the calcification of the valve. It's not quite as thick. And on the left, the valve severely calcified. You see large nodules of restricted tissue. That's our disease. One of the things that's missing from this is the bicuspid part of the practice, which is now one of the things we also treat as well with transcatheter techniques, although initially it was considered to be an absolute contraindication. Major risk factors: age, gender, male gender, hypertension, smoking, elevated lipoprotein A, but that's actually a marker for general hyperlipidemia as much as anything, elevated LDL cholesterol. Aortic valvular disease is an atherosclerotic process. What are the symptoms? Tara talked about this. I always think about aortic stenosis. I use the moniker ASK 532. A is angina, S is syncope, and C is congestive heart failure. And then the 532 is the relative 2-year survival with those diagnoses. So angina, syncope, breathlessness, dizziness, especially with activity, and sometimes initially after it, rapid irregular heartbeat, palpitations, and of course a 4% risk per year of sudden death in symptomatic aortic stenosis patients, function class 2 or higher. You've seen this slide before. I'll cut to the chase. The diagnostic modality of choice is echocardiography. That's how we start the process. Grading the severity of aortic stenosis per our current guidelines. If you look at the partner trial, they required a valve area of 0.8 or less. The national indications are a valve area not corrected for body surface area of a centimeter or less, a mean gradient of greater than 40, and a jet velocity of 4 meters a second. Those are the things. Getting one of those will qualify the patient from an echocardiographic perspective for transcatheter aortic valve therapy. Valve area index corrected for body surface area is 0.6. You've seen this slide before. Here you have on the right ASF, we should call it ASC, congestive heart failure. And then you see the relative survival marching to the left. So those patients that present with congestive heart failure have the highest 5-year to 2-year mortality period. This slide on the left, the green, actually is more closely mirrors bicuspid disease than it does standard aortic stenosis in a tricuspid and aging population. 5-year survival, and Tara touched on this. She mentioned that malignancies do better. If you look at lung cancer and inoperable aortic stenosis, inoperable aortic stenosis has a worse outcome than some of the most malignant malignancies. Unmet needs. Almost 40% of the patients in the world, probably in the United States, never are subjected to aortic valve intervention or therapy. The reason for that is underdiagnosis, underutilization, age, all those different things. But this is a huge population of individuals that are out there that are symptomatic with aortic valvular disease and aren't addressed. The partner trial, they bring this to you. This is from cohort B, the partner trial. But in the cohort B of the partner trial, they took inoperable patients, and they basically put angioplasty valvuloplasty as many times during the course of the treatment algorithm or period as they wished, and then they had optimal medical therapy. If you look at their results, 68% of them were dead in 2 years with medical therapy. And if you actually look at the 5-year outcome, there was only one 5-year survivor in the partner trial that was managed with medical therapy. So medical therapy, even valvuloplasty, does very poorly. High-risk patients, inoperable patients, that was the first indications for transcatheter therapy. It's now moved into the intermediate risk, and we'll define some of those things later. And then we actually have cases, studies that are ongoing. Nordic, Partner 3, and Medtronic all have studies looking at low risk. Of course, the key there will be the durability. But there's all kinds of different options. And Tara went through how we get the valve there. If you look over all of the different methodologies, the safest, stroke, major vascular access complications, death, all of those are driven transfemoral. So as the devices are engineered smaller and smaller, the transfemoral access goes up and up, and the process becomes safer and safer. Tavr procedure overview. This is the initial sapient valve. This was a stainless steel platform with a bovine pericardial valve, handmade in Palo Alto, in California. But I penciled in here intermediate risk now, but this is not the valve that made the trial for intermediate risk. It's their subsequent valve. If you look at that, it looks simple design, but it takes, I forget how many sutures, how many hours it takes to build one of those. It's all done manually. You've seen this slide, and those individuals that are too sick for surgery were initially considered for Tavr. Now, it's going to flip, so the point where all patients with aortic stenosis, I suspect in the next 2021 or 2022, will probably be treated with transcatheter technologies. This just basically shows you what it is, polyethylene trap. It's where, of course, Sapien 3, S3, now has a skirt around the bottom of the external part of it. That has limited the amount of aortic insufficiency, and that's been copied by most of the other manufacturers. I think we saw this. I don't know if I'll go through this again. If it is the one I think it is, Tara showed this, yes. This is the balloon valvuloplasty that she showed as well. Somebody asked a question about rapid ventricular pacing and how that works, what that doesn't drop the pressure. If you remember your cardiac physiology, the major determinant of myocardial stretch is filling, and diastole is the period of filling. The less stretch you have, the less myocardial contractility you have. So you shorten not only systole, but you shorten diastole. So with very rapid ventricular pacing, systole is shorter, diastole is shorter, and as a result, myocardial pressure falls, and so does ventricular ejection. So we drop the mean aortic pressure down to around 45 to 50 when we deploy the valve to prevent the valve from being ejected and also to maintain positioning during the deployment. Here's just the putting the sheath. The interesting thing about this is the very first sheath, I think it was 24 French, it was big as my finger. Okay? And we started with that. We did all of ours initially percutaneous. The current sheath you've seen out on the table is 14 French. And those I anticipate are going to be smaller as they engineer the device more. This, I think, is a picture of valvuloplasty. Oh, this is, you've seen this one before, she showed this there. And again, this valve is probably positioned a little bit low, increase the pacemaker risk, but it's, again, it's nicely deployed. You saw this one too, but one of the other options that Tara didn't talk about has been described by a gentleman at Henry Ford, and it's transcable. We go up the intermediate cave and poke a hole in the aorta with a bogey, and then put the entire big catheter deployment system from the inferior vena cava into the aorta, and then go from there. Of course, come out and use a ASB or VSB, actually a VSB device to close the access site of the aorta. So, very novel approach. All those things are associated with a lot more risk. So the key is getting there transfamily if you can. Transapical, our experience was by intent short, because those patients, they do about like open heart surgery, and the recovery is not much shorter. So moving away from transfemoral, when I first went to law in New Line, they did half surgically and half transfemorally, and I always wondered why. But now that has moved almost to entire transfemoral, transaxillary, transcarotid type of approach, percutaneously. This is a transapical approach. I'll skip that. Partner trial. This is important so that we understand the history of how we got here. And you take a very novel technology and you bring that to the United States, and you have to, first of all, you start with first in man, and you take the sickest patients and you prove the concept. The next thing you do is you do a pivotal trial, and that's usually the European CEU. And then after you do that, you come to the United States and you spend a couple of $1 billion designing a trial in the United States. This trial was called Partner, and it had two cohorts. A, which was surgical randomization, transfemoral, transapical, and then with a surgical arm. And the other one was those that weren't operable, and that was cohort B. So those patients were high risk, defined as greater than 50% predicted mortality. Functional class greater than 2. Most of the ones we've done in our life are more than 3. Aortic valve area 0.8, mean gradients we talked about. So these people weren't a candidate for anything else except balloon valvuloplasty in one part of the arm or Tavr. Primary endpoint is, did you die or did you live? And how long it took. If you look at it, neither one of these groups did extraordinarily well. I mean, 43% of the Tavr patients were dead in 2 years. But if you look at it, it's a lot better than the survival rate of those individuals that were treated with balloon valvuloplasty. If you look at the survival rate of people that aren't treated at all, it's dismal. But the point of this is that the p-value is point. You all know what significant p is. Well, you get to 4 digits to the right of the decimal point, and that's a big number. Okay, so this is very significant and a radical reduction in overall mortality in that patient population. Led to the indication of inoperable patients. Mean gradient over time, if you look at the blue line, that's valvuloplasty. Doesn't look very good, does it? The gradients stay there except for a short period now. Some of those people had more than one valvuloplasty. So when you look at the gradients on the Tavr, they dropped to 10, single digits, and it persisted through the 2-year period of the study. So clearly, the treatment of aortic stenosis was effective. Functional class here, we'll skip through this fairly quickly. If you look at it on the very left, those patients are fairly closely mirrored. I mean, the patients that were not treated versus the ones that were treated, they're the same patient population. Then you start looking over towards the right, and you see after a period of 2 years, there is, in the Tavr group, there's a very small light blue line and a smaller big dark blue line compared to the standard therapy. Lots of functional class 3 and functional class 4 patients despite treatment. So not only did it improve mortality, it improved their ability to walk, usually by 1 to 2, usually around 2 functional classes. All-cause mortality in that study, 5% within 30 days. In other words, the operative intervention was 5% despite the fact that the surgical risk of these patients was predicted to be over 50. Standard therapy 2.8. In other words, a lot of them didn't get any interventions done in the first part. But you swing over to 2 years, far right, 43% survival, standard therapy 69% death rate. If you look at strokes are one of the problems with the initial valve. I think that number has dropped a lot as the device is redesigned and its techniques to avoid that. And also distal protection, which adds another $1,800 for an already expensive procedure. Bleeding complications, clearly Tavr won. I mean, we had 16% major bleeds. If you look at how they define major bleeds, those are major bleeds. New pacemaker implantation. The surprise here to me, reviewing this, always has been how many patients with aortic stenosis blunt open patient reviews that didn't have TAVR. So if you look, for one reason or another, standard therapy had more pacemakers than the TAVR arm. Stroke. If you look at the green here, 30 days, 7% stroke rate, 11% stroke rate, and 14% stroke rate in 2 years. It's interesting that not all the strokes are immediately peri-procedural. In fact, the patient has a risk of stroke for up to 2 weeks after the intervention, but still stroke is a major part of this, and the mechanisms aren't clear. It might be scraping stuff off of the badly diseased ascending aorta, microembolization off the valve itself, perivalvular material that embolizes distally immediately after the TAVR. But stroke is something that is, everybody's trying to reduce. With the later trials, that stroke rate's dropped down to 4 to 4.8%, and actually is less than general cardiac surgery. Vascular complications. Pay attention to this number, 17%. Okay, and if you look at those things, those are serious vascular complications. And even with the cut downs and direct vascular access surgically, those were not small events. Rupture is one of those as well, but that's all the way down to about 4.8%. Most recently in the last Edwards trial, they're going to quote even lower. Bleeding events, transcatheter therapy has more bleeding. Think that it's a large catheter, it's a large device. Those patients are going to have percutaneous issues. So, take-home message, if you don't get treated, or if you get treated with valvuloplasty, your mortality in 2 years is 70%. Only 4 patients in a B arm that were required to be treated to save a life. At the cost of an increased risk of stroke and the increased risk of bleeding. Okay, here moving to cohort A. Remember I said that this is a surgical arm compared to transcatheter therapy. One is transfemoral, the other one is transapical. And they randomized those patients and had an STS predicted mortality of 10%. Most of the surgeons probably wouldn't really like to operate on patients with predicted mortality rates of 10 to 15%. Still, same numbers for the severity of the criteria. Primary endpoint again was all-cause mortality. This might be a little bit boring, but the history of how we got here and how they were able to prove the point and then refine it, I think is important. If you look at the baseline treatment, these people are functional class 4 and functional class 3, and if you remember the definition of functional class 3, it's symptoms on minimal exertion from here to the door. Functional class 4 is sitting in a chair, short of breath. So that's a large population of incredibly symptomatic patients. So if you look at 30 days, 1 year, 2 years, notice what happens to the functional class 4 patients almost becomes inconsequential. Most of those probably were the result of pace selection and bad ventricles, although they excluded everybody with ejection fraction less than 30%. But if you look at that, it was durable. Both of them were similar. So transcatheter aortic valve and surgical valve therapy had the same clinical outcomes with less morbidity and mortality, at least less morbidity. Stroke at 1-2 years, these numbers are not significantly different, but the stroke rate at 12 months, 6% and 3% in this arm. That's pretty good for surgical stroke rate with Tavr. But at the end of 2 years, the stroke rate is still higher than that medical arm, if you remember. Major vascular complications, still transcatheter aortic therapy was there. But note that in the inoperable patients, their number was 17% vascular access complications. And this is 11%, but that's 1% out of 10 as a major vascular access complication. Major bleeding, surgery loss. Okay, surgery makes sense. You know, there's open sternotomy and all the blood thinners that you see reoperation. In a very sick patient population, these are very high-risk patients to begin with. These aren't your 60-year-old, otherwise healthy patient. All-cause mortality. I threw this one in because this has become There's a couple of raging issues anymore, or not anymore, but moving forward in transcatheter therapy. One of them is called the patient prosthetic mismatch. And that's basically the patient's valve is too small for the patient. And that happens not only with Tavr, it happens with Tavr. And avoiding those types of things is the goal. There's some advantages of different designs, things of that nature, but I show this up that patient prosthetic mismatch is associated with increasing mortality, morbidity, hospitalizations. So that's become a fairly critical issue. Haynes is the guy that published a fairly large study here in the last year about the clinical relevance of this. We'll see a little bit later in the talk about some more data on it. But greater readmission rates, longer hospital stays, increased mortality if the device is too small for the patient. There's a variety of reasons for that to occur. Sometimes the annulus is so severely calcified you can't pick a bigger one. Design is also good into that. But if you look at mortality rate alone, independent prediction of 1-year mortality, but the device isn't right for the patient, it's almost as high as the operative mortality was in 30 days. Basically, the take-home from cohort B is those very sick patients with valvuloplasty medical therapy, they died. Okay, those patients that wanted to do Tavr had better survival at the risk of increasing stroke rates and vascular access complications. Cohort A, the data was across the board similar in terms of outcome, functional class. Surgery lost the bleeding issue. Tavr lost the vascular access rate. The pacemakers were fairly similar, and but outcomes were also similar. Both patients did better than either the cohort B Tavr group or the cohort B medical group. Here's a litany of different things that leads to considerations on who we Tavr, who we don't, what risk factors go into this determination of who's intermediate and high risk, and all those different things. Most of it's now based upon an STS score. One of the things I'll show a little bit later is STS doesn't really predict risk in every patient. In fact, some of the cardiac surgeons are better at predicting risk just by spending some time taking a look at the patient than the STS data scores. However, that's what we use at this time. You heard about the valve clinics. There's all kinds of different ways to do this, and it has to be tailored to what you have at your institution. Okay, do you have a large group of dedicated physicians in a single building, a university setting, where you can get 9 guys together on a Friday afternoon and look at that, or do you have a setting where you have 2 very busy cardiac surgeons that don't have time to drop by and do a valve clinic every day? So we designed this based upon what's best to get the work done and take care of the patients that we need. And you can see we have a virtual clinic. You can deal just with Tavr. You can have a structural heart program that deals with mitral valve, tricuspid clips, mitral clips, tricuspid rings, all those percutaneous options that are coming out. So the design of your structural heart group in your valve clinic is really designed around your resources, and that's what Danelle does. She is the coordinator of the structural heart clinic. Following the patient referral team, how do they get there? Well, they're generally seen by a primary doctor or a primary cardiologist, and they get an echo, and they wind up being sent into the Tavr evaluation. The surgeons see them. It has to be 2 surgeons on alternative days, stating that they initially were high risk or inoperable. Now it's intermediate risk or higher. Intermediate risk is defined as a predicted mortality of 4.5% to 5% or more with surgery. I put this slide in just to, this came from the New England Journals. Marty and Yoni and those guys are publishing all this stuff, but the reason I put this in here is the STS scores, like I said before, don't always reflect what the surgeon thinks. The surgeon might say, geez, they've got forced in the aorta, they've had previous bypass, they got 2 intramammary arteries that are used for grafts, they've got severe COPD, they're immobile. All those different things that go into discerning this. Inoperable, high, same thing applies to high risk. Intermediate risk is coming. SIR-TAVI is actually a Medtronic's trial with the initial core valve. but intermediate risk is now improved, rather, but the low risk is coming. These people have an SDS data score in this study of 4.4% plus or minus 1%, 6% predicted death, and the endpoint was death or disabling stroke. Embolic protection wasn't allowed. Stroke was similar in both groups, but it was best in all groups in transfemoral Tavr. So less bleeding, all definitions. So moving this to percutaneous transfemoral access is the goal, to find a way to actually take advantage of the lowest risk procedural access that you can. More bleeding was present in the surgical group. There was less patient prosthetic mismatch in the Tavr group. Remember we talked about mortality. So the Tavr valves, actually, the way that they're constructed, there might be some differences, but the way they're constructed, they have a better final valve area when you're done than the surgical valves. In this case, Tavr had 4% vascular access complication rate. In 8 years, 16 to 4. Okay, more atrial fib, the surgical group, more pacers, the Tavr group. The initial core valve had about a 40% pacemaker rate. The old joke was, is if the patient already had a pacemaker, you could use core valve. Both companies are now down to the point where their pacemaker rates are highly identical and in single digits. So all that's been done as a result of engineering. So more AR in Tavr, but a better orifice area in Tavr. One of the things that happened in the core valve trial was core valve had quite a bit of peri-procedural aortic insufficiency. In Edwards, they had their issues as well. In the Edwards data, it looked like perivalvular insufficiency was associated with increased mortality at 1 year and 2 years. It didn't pan out in the Medtronic's data where that perivalvular insufficiency wound up being an increased risk for death or disability. And it may have something to do with the mechanics of the nitinol valve. If you ever know what nitinol is an alloy, it stands for nickel titanium naval ordnance laboratory. It was discovered in World War II. But if you look at those glasses that you can get in any form, they go back to their initial form. That's nitinol. It's also called there. But they were able to engineer this with just incredibly high radial forces. That's why it just doesn't go shooting out and put it in. But those radial forces actually continue to push forever. Okay, so I think a lot of these people come back at later times with less aortic insufficiency and similar mortality risks. But it's just a design issue, and perhaps 6 of one, half dozen the other. Partner 2, intermediate risk. They use the second, the Sapien XT. S3 is now the current valve. You couldn't get, I don't think you can get a Sapien XT, but Sapien 3 is the current iteration. It had better valve areas with Tavr than with Savr, more AR, 3.7% than Savr, and it was severe. Mild and moderate was 21%, didn't seem to impact FNM, mortality and morbidity. Lower death rate, transfemoral. The stroke access and apical access was the same as surgery. Transfemoral, percutaneous delivery of the device is clearly way ahead of the safety range. Similar rates of pacemaker, 8.5% in Tavr, where I told you the numbers drop, and 7% in Savr. Low-risk trials, Medtronic's got one coming out, so this Medtronic's device will be with their Evolut Pro, which is core valve, Evolut R, at least their 4th iteration and design of Tavr. Again, since 2002, 2004. Okay, 4 different designs in that short period of time. Same thing with Edwards. Every time they find something that doesn't work, the engineers redesign nose cone length, nose shape, nose cone materials, device, one from stainless steel to cobalt chromium. A lot of different engineering has gone into these devices in the last decade. The low-risk criteria in the Medtronic's trial was 3%. The Edwards trial is actually defined as an SDS score of less than 2. These have to have low, 2 things have to happen. You have to have very low stroke rates. That's going to be 3 things. You have to have very low stroke rates, very low vascular access complication rates, excellent durability because these people are going to live for quite a while. You take a 50-year-old person and put a valve in them as low-risk valve percutaneously. You know, that's the debate about why we don't do those people with bioprosthetic valves currently anyway, although that's changing as a result of engineering. Edwards now has a bioprosthetic valve that during Tavr unhinges itself to make for better patient prosthetic match. So designing a surgical valve that can actually do things downstream. Bloxman, this is an interesting trial. I put this in here. It's a low-risk trial. It's not a single center, but it's investigator initiated. Most of these trials are funded by industry because they're so expensive, but 11 different centers got together and they decided, let's do our own trial, collect our data on our existing Tavr patients post-availability. 11 separate centers. The first 125 of 250 cases had no mortality, 0 risk of death, and in 30 days, no strokes. 4% major vascular access complications, 4% FIB, 8%, 4.8% pacemaker. And one of the things that they discovered, why I put this slide in here, is the phenomenon of what they call HALT, which is hypoattenuating leaflet thickening. One of the disadvantages, perhaps, of transcatheter therapy is durability. And we've been wrestling with that. The standard of care is aspirin, Plavix post-discharge. But in their trial, they discovered that about 12.5% of people had these hypoattenuating leaflet thickenings on 4D CT. And we now think that that's why both surgical bioprostheses and transcatheter bioprostheses are associated with early failure. They're thrombosing the valve. Okay? And what they found is overall, 14.4% of their patients with antiplatelet therapy had HALT. Then they looked at the patients that had warfarin and or direct anticoagulants. We used to call them NOACs, Xarelto, almost different agents. But those patients with direct anticoagulation, 21 of them had no HALT. Okay, so now we're trying to find, it's not proved yet, but every time we do one of these procedures, we're trying to find a way to put them on direct anticoagulation, so warfarin. Remember, valvular heart disease is an indication for a NOAC, but now we're probably going to move away from that. And this is maybe the holy grail of restenosis, is discovering something so simple as low-level thrombosis that leads to early valve failure and can be so simply reversed with simple anticoagulants. Medtronic trial is going to have 1,200 patients in it for that little GAR. Partner 3 is going to have 1,300 patients in it with SAPIEN 3, the two best designs on the market. The notion is, 2 is a European trial. They're going to take a hard look at this in a randomized fashion too, and we will know the answer to several questions. Does it work? What's the durability? And is it a safe and reasonable option for patients to have Tavr at any age and any type of valvular disease? SAVR is going to struggle. Going back to that, the gold standard is 3 numbers, 4, 4, and 1. 4 meters a second, 40 millimeters of mercury, and 1 centimeter of valve area. So when you look at the echoes of the patients you're taking care of, you go, those are the numbers you'll be looking for. This is one of the things that's most difficult to actually describe. It's also an indication for valvular intervention. What do you do with those patients with really bad ventricles that they can't squeeze hard enough to generate a gradient? Okay, what do you do with that patient with the old diastolic heart failure where the ventricles just not working up to snuff? And they come in, they're profoundly symptomatic, but they come in with a velocity of 3 meters a second, a gradient of 35, a valve area of 1.5 or something of that nature. You're going, geez, this just looks like aortic stenosis. Well, we found that in both of those cases, with bilbutamine, we can actually stimulate them and make their contractility increase enough that we can achieve those gradients and improve. We had one the other day where the gradient went to 5.5 meters a second velocity with a baseline of about 3.3 with 5 mics of bilbutamine. You went, well, that's real AS. Okay, but that patient without that challenge would have not been considered a candidate for transcatheter therapy. Frailty, we talked about that. I'm going to skip through this. I would probably say, from a nursing perspective and a doctor perspective, you can use your Mark IV eyeball. You walk into a room and there's a 90-year-old lady sitting there, and she's on the phone and watching TV and talking and laughing, and she's mobile, and she goes to the bathroom fine, and she came in off the golf course. And then you got a 60-year-old lady that's sitting there in a chair, can't breathe, can't move, and can't even assist herself to the bedside toilet. So you know that just that general gestalt is, one's going to do very well, the other one isn't going to do very well. And that's been, the Mark IV eyeball test is the one we used to apply, but we actually have real rules now in terms of assessing frailty. And I'm not going to go all over those, but this is one of the things that the Tavr coordinator does, and there's a variety of different scales and things that we use that are instrumental in predicting how people, Dr. Tavr says, I'm not going to operate this guy because he can't get out of bed, he won't rehab. Okay, he just did a frailty score. Okay, that's a Mark IV frailty score. But the Columbia Frailty Index, gait, speed, grip strength, everybody gets a walk test. So we'll know a little bit about it before we're done. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. Vascular access. We've talked about this quite a bit because of its importance. One of the things that's happened from a design perspective is these devices have gotten smaller, more facile, and better designed. Cobalt chromium allowed them to make the stent rings thinner. Cobalt chromium is a lot more stiff, it's tougher. That alloy is harder to machine to do, but when they made the cobalt chromium stent, it took all the stainless steel thickness out of it, and all of a sudden it got tiny compared to the old ones. So you can get these in. When we were first starting, we were concerned about vessels that were 7 and 8 millimeters. Now, both of these devices can get in vessels that are 5 to 5.5 millimeters. That's a quarter of an inch. Remember I told you the first sheets? Now we can get in a vessel a quarter of an inch. That's a small femoral artery. Atherosclerotic disease, we can get by that as well. So those individuals, this is the initial safety valve. Those that are high risk should be referred to Tavr, and I think that the question is going to be, intermediate risk as well right now. And I think by 2022, it's going to be low risk. Treatment plan, this is just how we build a Tavr team. This is Danelle's job. So if you have any questions, call her. Pacemakers and prosthetic mismatch. Important because they increase cost, they increase length of stay. There's issues with respect to how the ventricle responds when the valve's not right, and we know that it's associated with mortality and morbidity. So trying to be in the middle of the ambulance. Medtronic's claim is that we can actually do that angular, and we can pull all that valve hardware up above and make it a little bit bigger. As a result, we get better areas. It's a little bit more challenging to put in. Both of these devices have good durability and pretty good valve areas, so it's tough competition. But this is the Medtronic's iteration, and core valve, Evolut R, and Evolut Pro. And I'm not supposed to talk about this, but I've seen some designs that are even more elegant than this. So I guess I could say that. Single-digit gradients. Effective orifice area is at 2 centimeters. I mean, normal natural valve is about 2.5 in most patients, but look at that. That's almost as large as a natural valve. Everybody comes out with a Tavr or Tavr with mild aortic stenosis. Nobody goes home with normal areas. Heals in. Pericardial tissue is durable, as is the bovine. And this is what it looks like as it's going in, and it's retrievable. If you don't like the way you put it in the first time, you can take it back out and put it back in. If you don't like that, you can take it out, back out, and put it back in. If you don't like that, you'll be tired. I can say that for an hour. So position becomes, it's technically a little bit more demanding, but you can get it where you want it. And there's all kinds of different tricks, but it's their design of their device is actually different now than the ones we first started with. Size, deliverability, ease of use. This delivery device looks exactly like the device that they use for their stent grafts. And it's got a lot of the different functions and forms. So, and there's their valve. They maintain that they're the only platform that shows superiority. Remember, non-inferior is different than superior. To show superiority in a randomized control trial and have that result be sustained for 3 years. In other words, it's pretty good stuff. All-cause mortality in stroke, the core valve initial data, high-risk patients, looks surprisingly like the initial data in Edwards. Evolut Pro characteristic systems, if you look at their trial that they're doing, these are old patients that are sick, panic, function class 3, peripheral vascular disease, all the different things that go on in this elderly patient population. Their data suggests that 90% of people got better with the functional class. Some didn't change. Those are probably patients with baseline bad ventricles. We used to say no to anybody with an EF less than 30. I think we've treated multiple patients that have EFs around 20. Those patients always get a lot better. It's sometimes frustrating. Paravalvular leak. This was a real problem for Medtronic's early in the course of their trials because of the design of the core valve. All those metal struts sitting in that outflow tract keep the valve from actually burying itself in the tissue. The new skirt, which I don't know where they borrowed that from, but the new skirt has done away with a lot of that, as it has with the Edwards device. Evolut Pro clinical trials, support data to every other trial in terms of outcomes, mortality, morbidity. There's an Argentinian Brown trial, and the same old guy. But that was a monster. I'm going to spend the last part of the study, the talk, on a couple of the issues. We talked about patient-prosthetic mismatch, but the biggest issue that will go into our future of implanting valves in low-risk patients that are young is durability. And that's been a question. Everybody says, the durability is good. And I kind of accepted that at face value, but there's a couple of articles that have been recently published in this month's JACC. And it's very interesting. Blackman et al. in JACC this month, in the UK registry. Remember, they've been doing them in Europe longer than we've been doing them in the US. So they took 241 patients, which for in that registry is actually quite a few patients. And they followed them up for a mean of 5.8 years, but it ranged all the way to 10 years. 64% of the valves were self-expanding, 35.7 were balloon expanded. Lower gradients in both valves at 5 years versus surgical data, 17 versus 19, between the two valves. AR, non-trivial, in the self-expanding ones, 47%, and the balloon expanding 33%. So they still have designs on the market. The notion, too, is a European trial. They're going to take a hard look at this in a randomized fashion, too. And we will know the answer to several questions. Does it work? What's the durability? And is it a safe and reasonable option for patients to have Tavr at any age and any type of valvular disease? Tavr is going to struggle. Going back to that, the gold standard is 3 numbers, 4, 4, and 1. 4 meters a second, 40 millimeters of mercury, and 1 centimeter of valve area. So when you look at the echoes, the patients you're taking care of, you go, those are the numbers you'll be looking for. This is one of the things that's most difficult to actually describe. It's also an indication for valvular intervention. What do you do with those patients with really bad ventricles that they can't squeeze hard enough to generate a gradient? Okay, what do you do with that patient with the old diastolic heart failure where the ventricles just not working up to snuff? And they come in, they're profoundly symptomatic, but they come in with a velocity of 3 meters a second, a gradient of 35, and a valve area of 1.5 or something of that nature. You're going, geez, this just looks like aortic stenosis. Well, we found that in both of those cases, with bilbutamine, we can actually stimulate them and make their contractility increase enough that we can achieve those gradients and improve. We had one the other day where the gradient went to 5.5 meters a second velocity with a baseline of about 3.3 with 5 mics of bilbutamine. He went, well, that's real AS. Okay, but that patient without that challenge would have not been considered a candidate for transcatheter therapy. Frailty, we talked about that. I'm going to skip through this. I would probably say, from a nursing perspective and a doctor perspective, you use your Mark IV eyeball. You walk into a room and there's a 90-year-old lady sitting there and she's on the phone and watching TV and talking and laughing, and she's mobile and she goes to the bathroom fine, and she came in off the golf course. And then you got a 60-year-old lady that's sitting there in a chair, can't breathe, can't move, and can't even assist herself to the bedside toilet. So you know that just that general gestalt is, one's going to do very well, the other one isn't going to do very well. And that's been, the Mark IV eyeball test is the one we used to apply, but we actually have real rules now in terms of assessing frailty. And I'm not going to go all over those, but this is one of the things that the Tavr coordinator does, and there's a variety of different scales and things that we use that are instrumental in predicting how people. You know, Dr. Tavr says, I'm not going to operate this guy because he can't get out of bed and he won't rehab. Okay, he just did a frailty score. Okay, that's a Mark IV frailty score. But the Columbia Frailty Index, gait, speed, grip strength, everybody gets a walk test. So we'll know a little bit about them before we're done. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. Vascular access. We've talked about this quite a bit because of its importance. One of the things that's happened from a design perspective is that these devices have gotten smaller, more facile, and better designed. Cobalt chromium allowed them to make the stent rings thinner. Cobalt chromium is a lot more stiff, it's tougher. And alloy is harder to machine to do, but when they made the cobalt chromium stent, it took all the stainless steel thickness out of it, and all of a sudden it got tiny compared to the old ones. So you can get these in. When we were first starting, we were concerned about vessels that were 7 and 8 millimeters. Now, both of these devices can get in vessels that are 5 to 5.5 millimeters. That's a quarter of an inch. Remember I told you the first sheets? Now we can get in a vessel a quarter of an inch. That's a small femoral artery. Atherosclerotic disease, we can get by that as well. So those individuals, this is the initial safety valve. Those that are high risk should be referred to Tavr, and I think that the question is going to be, it's going to be intermediate risk as well right now. And I think by 2022, it's going to be low risk. Treatment plan, this is just how we build a Tavr team. This is Danelle's job. So if you have any questions, call her. Pacemakers and prosthetic mismatch. Important because they increase cost, they increase length of stay. There's issues with respect to how the ventricle responds when the valve's not right, and we know that it's associated with valve morbidity. So trying to maybe Tavr wins the low risk. So we put in therapy prosthetic valve. If it fails in 15 years, okay, bar the door, we'll put a Tavr in or something else. Anybody else? What's that? Artificial flyers. I called my friend on that redfish because it was probably around 70 pounds. I took a picture. That's modern technology. And I can't actually text. But I actually took a picture of this. My guide did. And I sent it to him. He says, that's the fish of a lifetime. About 15 minutes later, I put another one in the boat. And I took another picture. And I said, this is a fish of a lifetime too. So those were absolutely monster redfish that we caught for a 10-weight fly rod. Bruises on both hips. They don't give up very easy. All right.